Hey friends, I'm Greg Nettle and I serve as president of Stadia Church Planting, where our vision is for every child on the planet to have a church. We do this by helping you start thriving, growing, multiplying churches for the next generation. Whether you're a church planter, an investor, or a church leader, we want to help you get new churches started. Today on the Church Planting Podcast, we have a very special friend, my colleague, Doug Foltz, who is, how should I describe this? Self-proclaimed church planting junkie. I could have talked to Doug for hours, and sometimes we do. We just get on and we talk about all things church planting, things to come. Doug is entrepreneurial, he's future thinking, and he has his finger on the pulse of what's going on in church planting in the United States and around the world. This is a great episode with Doug Foltz, the Church Planting Podcast. Welcome, Doug, to the Church Planting Podcast.
Hey, Greg. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Hey, Doug, let's just talk about just kind of some of your experience. I mean, you and I have been colleagues now for 11 years and working in the church planting world. What got you involved in church planting?
Well, it's a Holy Spirit story, Greg. I was involved in church planting before I knew I was involved in church planting. I could go all the way back into my Bible college days and talk about mission trips and things that I did. Inevitably, I always ended up helping out at a church plant. In 1999, when I started my grad work, I was a part of what was called the Church Planting Assessment Center quite often. And so I really fell in love with church planners through the assessment center. I was really heavily involved with it at that time, but I would tell you, like, I also kind of knew too much. And so when it came time for me to be done with seminary and go, okay, what's my ministry career going to be? I was like, anything, please, but church planting. Like, I have seen it. I see how hard it is. Like, I see and I was like, I need something safe. So I pursued lots of different, ministry opportunities, and like God just kept closing the door, like slam right in my face, one after the other. I was at a church planting assessment center, and I came home like it was probably like 2:00 in the morning. I wake up my wife, and I'm like just so excited. I'm just on fire. Like I'm just pumped about all these different church planners, what they're doing. And my wife tells me in that moment, she says, "You know what? Like I think I know what your calling is." Now, I'd been graduated at this point for a few months. I hadn't been able to find a job, so I wasn't particularly nice to her in that moment, Greg. I
Oh
may have
boy.
said something like, "Oh, enlighten me.
Yeah.
What is my calling, a wise one?"
Yeah.
Probably not my best moment. And she just kind of, looked at me and she said, "Well, I think you're called to church planting, and I think you've been running away from God."
Wow.
So for me, that was like that pivotal moment where I was like, yep, that was the prophetic voice I needed at that moment in my life. We began praying together. And really everything kind of fell into place. After that, we went and moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, a few months later, and we're part of our first church plant there.
Okay. And then the next, I mean, since I've known you, you've been involved in helping literally hundreds and thousands of church planters and in
Yeah.
the process of church planting. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So when we planted the church in Charlotte, we were very much it was kind of that plant with an apprentice, kind of in place. We were supposed to be that apprentice. Of course, as a plant, I love the church planting aspect. I'd been there for about 3 years, and I honestly, I started to be a little bit bored. Um, the team we had was great. I loved our team. I loved our church. We baptized 100 people in the first 3 years of our church plant. Everything was going great. I was just a little bit bored because honestly, we were kind of entering into that phase where we weren't a brand new church anymore. So I thought, well, I'm supposed to go plant now.
Yep.
But there was something nagging there that I was like, man, I don't know if that's the right fit for me. So I actually went back through our assessment process a second
Yep.
time, and was affirmed to go plant a church. But I still had that nagging doubt in the back of my head. So I went through a call and design process with a Christian therapist. What I discerned in the process of that was I'm called to church planting, but I was not called to be that catalyst that apostolic, kind of leader. That I was really kind of the person that comes alongside and supports that person.
Yep.
And I was also wired for new. Like that was the weird thing in the midst of it was like, uh, what I discovered was like, man, if I'm not part of creating new things, that I will get bored and I'll want to move on. And so I was just like confused. It's like, man, I don't know that that even exists.
Yep.
But God does God things. Like He's always working upstream in our lives, and so it wasn't too much longer that I got a phone call saying, "Hey, we'd like to hire you to be a project manager and help church planters to execute on the vision that they have for their new churches." And Stadia was a partner with that organization at that time. A couple years later, then Stadia kind of hires me away from them to build project management within our systems and structures at Stadia.
Okay, so you have a lot of years working with church planters now, and a lot
Yeah.
of different modalities, different types of church plants, and a lot of years in research and development in church planting. Um,
Hmm.
the good, the bad, the ugly. We always say, one of the reasons that you're such an expert is because you've walked through the mistakes, the good, the hard, the bad, the joys, the tears, so many times, and you've written down and learned from it. And so the topic of our, time together today is kind of looking at 5 mistakes that you've watched church planters make. But Doug, I need to tell you that, as I've looked through these 5, mistakes church planters make, I would say that every single one of them are the same mistakes that church leaders in established churches also
Mm.
make. Like, I look at them and I go, "Ooh, man, I was 20 years in, to River Tree, and I still need to look back at this list and make sure I'm not making those mistakes."
Yeah.
And so I think for our audience today of church planters and church leaders, specifically, even business people, these are going to be very meaningful mistakes that we need to watch out for. So let's just jump right in there and start.
Yeah.
What's mistake number one that we need to watch out for?
Yeah. So mistake number one is planting alone. Uh, so again, like I've been doing this since 1999. And if I were to go back kind of into that late 90s, early 2000s stage, like everything was team based back then. I would say there was a shift around 2008, 2009 when we had the Great Recession, where just because of the economic realities, we kind of got away. And I said by we, I mean kind of the church planting movement as a whole, kind of got away from more team based church planting and got into kind of more solo church planting. And if you look at like we call what we used to call the assessment center, we now call it Stadia. We call that a discovery event.
Yep.
So we're helping church planners to discover their calling, their competency, and their readiness to plant a church. And if you look at Stadia's church planting competencies, Greg, we have 20 different church planting competencies. It's a lot. Like, and what I tell you is like no one is all of those things.
Right.
So I've worked with hundreds of church planners. I have yet to ever see a church planner that is an A plus on all 20 of those competencies. No
Yep.
one, right? But a team can be. And so what I'm really encouraged about now and kind of where things seem to be pivoting and moving is back towards this idea and this concept of planting as a team. It's a little bit different than it was 20 years ago. Now, there's been some great thinkers and leaders that have helped us along. The APEST out of Ephesians 4, that really was, I think, 20 years ago now that Alan Hirsch
Yep.
and Michael Frost, first came out with their book where they talked about this concept of APEST. You've got some more modern, people that have grabbed onto that and kind of continued that stream of understanding the apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher role. And I think that's really helped to kind of reshape the imagination around what church planting leadership can look like. Uh, I would tell you too, like there's a younger generation. Greg, here's the funny thing. Like I feel kind of old even telling you this, but like I have now planted churches with boomers, with Xers, with millennials, and now Gen Z,
Yep.
which makes me feel old. But the younger that trend, so more younger millennials in particular, and Gen Z definitely, they are really moving to embrace these collaborative leadership models. And so
Yeah.
I think that's exciting.
So
Yeah,
Doug,
go
let
ahead.
me just, I mean, the reality is we would say in ministry, you never do ministry alone, right? It was, I
Yeah.
mean, the fact that Jesus had 12 disciples, it wasn't like Jesus went off by himself and did ministry all the time. He was constantly back with his group of leaders, that he was involved with, and then the crowds. So what's the danger though of doing ministry alone or planting alone?
Oh, Greg, there's so many. One, like, church planting is lonely as it is, right? It's that uh, if you're not a part of a team where you have other people who are in it with you, who own that with you, man, church planting is a lonely and isolating place. And so I'll talk a little bit more about spiritual formation in a bit, but that really comes down to a big part of the danger of it is
Yeah.
that we're alone, and we're not meant to be alone. We're not created to be alone. So that's one. And then a second one that I see over and over and over again is just that, like, a church cannot be sustained with one leader. It just can't. Eventually, as the founding pastor, you're going to leave, whether that's because you move on to the next thing or you die. And if the church has been formed and shaped around just one central leader, it'll have a short lifespan. And then the other piece, Greg, is multiplication. Stadia is a church multiplication organization. That's what we really love and that's what we care about. And you cannot multiply a church without leaders. Like, this just becomes so critical to the work of a church planner is to develop leaders and send them out to start other churches. And if you're planting alone and you're never really doing that work of developing a team, you're never going to multiply.
Yep. Okay, let's move on to mistake number 2 to avoid.
All right, so I don't have great words for this one, so maybe you can help me with it. But mistake number 2 is not contextualizing. So let me kind of flesh that out a little bit. But this is if you go, like, Ed Stetzer said this a long time ago. He said, "Don't plant the church in your head. Instead, you plant the church in your community." Right. And so we see this over and over is that church planters will plant the church in their heads. And so they go and they begin to plant the church before really doing that missionary work of cultural exegesis. Let me give you one small example. I had a church planter last year that they had been an associate pastor at a large suburban church, and that church was doing great ministry. Like, they were growing, they were baptizing lots of people, they were seeing people come to faith, and they just God put a burden on that church's heart to reach the downtown of the city that they lived near, and so they said, "Hey, we're gonna go plant a church there." And so the church planter, they send him out. They say, "Go move. We want you to live downtown." He goes and he does that, and his initial plan was like, I love this church. Like, we're just going to start the same thing in the city, right?
Yep.
Um, about 6 months later, I get a call, and he's just distraught, and he's like, "Man, I don't know what to do." He's like, "This isn't going to work." And I'm like, "What's this?" And he's like, "Church planning. It's not going to work." I'm like, "Well, tell me more. What are you seeing that's not going to work?" And he's like, "Every person that I meet down here that doesn't know Jesus," he's like, "they don't really care about a Sunday morning service."
Yeah.
He's like, "They just don't. They don't care about how good a preacher I am. They don't care that I've got a really cool band." He's like, "They don't care about any of that." He's like, "If I go start this worship service, like, no one's coming to that." So here was the great thing. Like, we had our crisis moment. We prayed together, and then we pivot, right? And we begin to go, all right, like, let's actually do this work of cultural exegesis. Let's get to know our community. Let's get to know, like, how do we say and communicate the gospel? If you fast forward kind of to the end of the story, he determined, like, hey, the best thing for me is not to be a full-time professional pastor here in the downtown area, but to be one of in the business community. And so he got a job, really cool job. He was able then to build relationships on a whole different level within that community. And he began to start micro churches. Within 6 months, they had 3 micro churches. And the next call was like, like how do I multiply this because
What
it's
do I do
starting to get
now?
out here. Yeah. So those are fun conversations to have, but that gets back to that contextualizing piece, right? If he'd have done that work on the front end, he wouldn't have had all that, time and money and effort that was spent to realize like, oh goodness, this isn't going to work. So at
So
the end of the
Doug,
day, like,
it's one of Stadia's, core tenets. Like when we plant
yeah,
globally, we plant with indigenous church planters. And we
yeah,
do
yeah,
that intentionally because we want the church planter to be part of that country, that community that they already live in. And it's the same, wherever you're planting, if you're planting in the United States or Europe or Australia,
yeah,
you've got to be one of that community, and you don't become one of overnight unless you've really grown up
no,
there. I mean, it would be if you were starting a new church in Cleveland, Ohio, the last thing you want to do is move into Cleveland from Pennsylvania and say, "Hey, everybody, I'm a Pittsburgh Steelers fan." Right? I mean, I'm not joking. Like your
yeah.
church would be dead. As goofy as that sounds, you have to understand the culture and contextualize
Logo
to the
colors are all going to be black and yellow, right, Greg?
yeah, right, exactly, right? But we watch church planters and ministries, churches that never really understand the culture around them. They're almost sequestered away, right?
Here's this interesting thing as you say that. This is what brings my mind is like we see over and over that church planners who are moving back home and they're moving into the
Yes,
community that they grew up in, like
yes.
they have better results quicker, right? We all know why. It's because they've kind of lived that cultural exegesis, right? Another story, Greg. I had a church planner, and I want to say this one because I think this is good for our church planners or wannabe church planners that are listening to this podcast, right? So we had a Stadia church planner that had been highly successful. I planted a church in Southern California, and it just blew up big. They became a church planting church. They had a little, network of churches that they had started there in Southern California. That leader then left, went on the mission field, had success on the global mission field, came back to the United States then and said, "Hey, you know what? Like I want to plant a church again," and wanted to move to the Mountain West to start a new church. Came through our discovery process. And one of the things that we told him was we said, "Hey, you're not ready to go start that church." And he's like, "What in the world do you mean? Like, I'm not ready. Like I've planted, this is not my first time for planting a church. I know what I'm doing." And we said, "Yeah, you do. You know exactly what you're doing, but you don't know the Mountain West. You just don't." And so we said, "Hey, the best thing for you is going to be to go move in Mountain West, live there for a year, and just learn the community. Don't be a pastor
Yep,
for a year. Just go be one of, like you're saying."
yep.
So he went and moved there, and again, like part of the barrier to this, Greg, for so many is that if we've been kind of trained in the traditional model of a Bible college and seminary, like, hey, I want to be a pastor, so I go to college to be a pastor, then we need to earn our income being a pastor. And that
Yeah,
makes this incredibly difficult to do this missionary work then because there's no church, there's nobody to pay my salary. And he was definitely in that boat. So, he moved his family to Mountain West, and for a year he worked at a fast food restaurant. Now, that's pretty humbling, to do, to go from successful church planner, large church pastor, success on the mission field to I'm now working at a fast food restaurant,
yep.
right? But he does that for a year, and then he plants the church, a much more contextualized church as a result. He learned a ton over the course of that year that he is then able to put into play. And then now we're about 4 years removed from that. And he's now moved on to starting the next thing. And guess who is now leading that church? The guy that now leads that church is somebody that he worked with at that fast food restaurant,
Wow.
right? Just a really, really cool story. So again, just that takes time. It takes sacrifice on the part of a church planner to go, what, I'm going to go humble myself and I'm going to flip burgers or whatever for, for a year. But I'm going to do that because it's going to help me to plant a church that's contextualized to the community that I'm a part of.
Okay, so Doug, and it's contextualized for planting, but I'm just thinking about, church leaders. Let's say the church plant is
Yeah.
now 3 years old, or you've been the senior pastor for or visionary leader for 10 years or whatever. It's really
Mm.
easy to lose touch with the context that you're in as well, because now
Yeah.
you're leading a church and you're involved with all the church people. And that's the death knell as well. And so I think contextualization has to go on throughout our ministry. So we have don't plan alone, make sure that you
Yep.
contextualize. And then mistake number three.
Yeah. Mistake number three is that not having a spiritual formation plan for yourself. Uh, and it almost sounds funny, like really, like, especially maybe for business leaders that are listening in, like you're telling me that pastors may not have their own plan for spiritual formation. But Greg, it just like I see it so many times is that I'm working with a church planner and they really don't have any intentional plan for their own spiritual formation. And here's why that, I mean, everybody, I think every Christian should. But here's why that's particularly dangerous for a church planter, right? I have kind of one of my elevator speeches that I give, Greg, that's like the one universal of church planting is that you will face spiritual attack, right?
Absolutely.
Context is like, yeah, there's going to be all kinds of details here, here, and here that make it different. But the one universal, I don't care what model, I don't care what location, you are going to face spiritual attack. And for a lot of church planners, like that may be the first time they really significantly face spiritual attack. And then the downside to that is like if the leader does not really take seriously their spiritual formation, that's going to trickle down into their family. And their children aren't going to take spiritual formation seriously. And it eventually is going to trickle down into the new church that they start. And so this is why for us at Stadia, this is one of our core competencies, right? That we look at and we help planners to discern in the midst of our discovery process is where are they at on that? What do they need to do? One of the very first things that we do in project management with our church planners is we take them through a process that we call designed to thrive. And it's all about taking what we've learned about ourselves in that discovery process and going, let's build a customized spiritual formation plan so that I can thrive in my relationship with God. I can be healthy as I go and plant this church. Like Greg, probably one of the things that just like it's a red flag for sure. And one of the things that I hear regularly that just almost scares me when I hear it is it like, and this is just part of how planners are wired. They're driven. They want to run. They want to go. They
Yeah.
see where they're going and they want to go after it, right? But they don't want to slow down. And so in the midst, like if I'm asking them questions about their spiritual formation, like when was the last time you took a day off? When was the last time you went on a date, with your wife? Do your kids still know your name? No, not really on that one. But I'll hear this thing back. Like they'll say it's only a season. And man, that's like big red flag. Wait, time out, stop. Because it doesn't only end up being a season. Usually those habits that get formed in the startup of the church don't become a season. They become a habit that lasts a long time. And then we experience burnout. We experience moral failure, all because we didn't take the time early on to seriously think about what does our own spiritual formation look like.
Doug, I was meeting with a group of leaders that I'm mentoring right now, just this week, earlier this week, and I was
Mm,
sharing with them that the single most important thing that I learned and developed this year, and I've been in ministry now a lot of years, was another way to look at my spiritual plan, my spiritual formation plan. Um,
mm,
so with all that we're involved in, right, and planting churches all
yeah,
around the world, I'm going, the single most important thing that Greg Nettle can do is to stay spiritually healthy and close to God. I need you church
amen.
planters and leaders to hear that because we need you in the game for the long haul. We need you to have a close relationship with God. You can't give away what you don't have. And we don't want to see your marriages flaming out and you giving into different, temptations. We're all going to struggle. Let's just own that. But it's that depth of having that plan in place, people in place that will, keep us from making mistakes that will damage the kingdom, our lives, our families. These are invaluable, Doug. What's number 4?
Number 4 is too much time on tasks and not enough time with people. So this may sound weird, but as somebody who's focused on the tasks, somebody who's a project manager who wants to get all the stuff done, I would tell church planners over and over and over that they need to spend more time with people. So I'm working right now, Greg, on a dissertation for my doctorate of ministry. And one of the things that I've been doing is just asking this question to church planners and denominational leaders is how much time do you spend on tasks versus people time? And it almost, with very little variation, it almost always comes back about 70% of the time that a church planner spends is on tasks behind a screen. And 30% of their time is spent with people. And then I'll ask them the follow-up question is like, well, what do you think it should be? And almost everybody would say it's the reverse. Everybody would say, man, I really wish that I had 70 to 80% of my time to spend with people and only 20 to 30% of my time, on tasks.
Yeah. But you and I have been involved in church plants, Doug. So I mean,
Yeah,
I'm going, yeah, I get it, but what the heck do we do? I mean, those tasks have to get done.
they do have to get done. That's true. And I think though, there's all kinds of answers to this, but I think part of it is that we're wrapped up very much in our thinking. We value ourselves and we create our identity around what we produce. That's
Yeah.
very American, right? And in church planning, it's just the people side of it's pretty hard. It's pretty complicated. I think, it feels like it's getting harder, all the time as we become more and more post-Christian in our culture. And at the end of the day, if I can go, look, I knocked these 5 things off of my task list, that feels a
Yeah.
whole lot better than to go, well, you know what? I met with some people, but I didn't get anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think, we've always recognized at Stadia that like relationships are so important. It's been a value from day one. We're a 20-year-old organization. Relationships been a value since day one, right?
Yes.
And the reason for that, Greg, is that relationships, when you think about church multiplication, it really comes down to 2 things. Are we making disciples as a church and are we developing leaders as a church? It comes down to those 2 things. You can't do those things as a task behind a screen. Those are relational tasks that you have to do with people. And so we really push and encourage our church planners to flip that 70% of your time with people, 30% of your time in tasks. But you're right. It is a very difficult tension, and the system of church is going to push you to do the tasks and be behind the screens. One of the things, like, again, I work in project management at Stadia, and but always our goal as project managers has always been to help church planners have more time to focus on people.
Yes.
And one of the things, Greg, I'm really excited about, and this is what I'm researching in my dissertation work, is I really truly believe that we are on the cusp with generative AI of being able to unlock that potential in a lot of exciting new ways. But here's the thing: like, if our identity is all wrapped up in what we produce and what we do, then we're gonna create a lot of time, right? We're gonna save a lot of time with AI, but we'll backfill that time with something else to produce,
Yes.
right? So we've got to be able to change that heart piece within us, and we've got to be able to understand that our role as disciplers, our role as leader developers, right, is people oriented. It's people first. We've got to get back to the days where being a pastor meant I'm going to spend most of my time with people.
Okay, so you know how excited I am about generative AI. And so we're just gonna have a little tease here that 6 months to a year from
Yeah.
now, I'm gonna have you back on the podcast and we're gonna do a whole episode on how to use generative AI in your ministry so
Oh,
you
that'd
can
be
spend
fun.
more
Yeah.
time, so you can spend more time with people. Okay, so Don't plan alone. Make sure you contextualize. Make sure you have, you plan for your own spiritual formation. Spend time with people. What's number 5?
Well, number 5 is not building relationships with people who don't follow Jesus.
Yep.
Which again, this is another one of those. It's like, kind of really like, I thought that was the whole point, and it is the whole point. Like we all say that when we start a church. Everyone says, "Well, I'm starting a church to make new disciples," but it's really hard. uh, and so one of the things that we'll ask church planners and project management is not just like, what's your strategy for reaching people in the community, and maybe it's, if you're in a launch large model, like, what's your strategy for Sunday to make sure that unchurched people feel comfortable. But we'll just ask them straight up, like, who are the unchurched people that like, name them, list them.
Yes.
What are some next steps that you're taking
List
with
them. Yes.
Yeah, list them. Give me their names. And it's one of those things where again, if you're not intentional around it, it doesn't happen. Unless you're an evangelist. Like, evangelists tend to naturally do it, but
Yeah,
if
it
you're
happens
not naturally an
Yep.
evangelist, like, we just have to be intentional about it, and we just have to recognize that, like, man, all the momentum and all the forces that are play in our life are going to keep us in our own little kind of Christian safe bubble, right? So we have to be uber intentional about spending time with people who don't follow Jesus. I just talked to a church planner just this week, and he's doing some fantastic, amazing things. But as we were talking, we began to go, hey, let's now think about 6 months from now, after things have started up, like, let's do some goal setting. So we started working on some of that, talking through what was going to be important for that church, what their lead metrics were going to be, those sorts of things. And it was beautiful. Like, he was coming up with all these different things about reaching people who don't know Jesus in their community, and how they would measure that, and how they would encourage that with their leadership within their church. And then it was like, there was this pause, Greg. and as he paused, it'd be like, I could tell, like, okay, he's about to say something here. And it became like this confessional moment. And he said, I've been in ministry for a long time. I've been a part of some really fast growing churches, but I've never been a part of a church that actually is intentionally trying to reach people far from Jesus.
Wow.
He says, I know God's calling me to do this. I'm not sure I know how.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So that's, and that, I loved that confession. We had some great conversation around that. Again, like, where does it start? It starts with, what's your list? Who do you know? Like, who are your neighbors? Who are the people in your life that don't know Jesus? That's really, really where it starts. It sounds so simple, but that's where it starts. It starts in the leader living out that lifestyle, right? I can give you one other example, as well. As I was talking this week with another one of our church planners, and we were talking about kind of the follow-up process. Like, how do we follow up and connect people into the church? And I was just listening to him describe his system of how he was going to do this. And in my head, again, because of all my years at Stadia, like, this has been beat into me. Like, I have to just think about, the person that's far from God. That's my filter for thinking about those kinds of things. And so as I'm listening to him share that story, I'm like, man, he's thinking about church people. And so, I'm patient, I'm listening. And when he gets done, describing, I just asked one question. I said, how would this be different if you were designing this for people who didn't know Jesus? And that question just unlocked a really great conversation. But here's the thing. If we design all of our church systems for Christians, we are very highly likely to attract and produce consumer Christians. And we're likely to unintentionally ignore the people that Jesus came to seek and to save. And so we've got to always be asking that question, and we've always got to make sure that we're building relationships with people who don't follow Jesus.
5 mistakes that we can make in church planting, and I believe in leadership in general. Doug Foltz, thank you for being on the Church Planting Podcast. Look forward to talking with you about generative AI next time.
All right. Thanks, Greg. It's an honor.
Thanks for listening to the Church Planting Podcast. The Church Planting Podcast is part of the Stadia Podcast Network. To find more great episodes and to see how Stadia can help you start thriving, growing, multiplying churches for the next generation, be sure to check out stadia.org/podcasts.